Hello, everyone. Welcome to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning. I'm going to wait just a moment to let everyone log in, but in the meantime, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located at the bottom of your screen. You can use this at any time to ask questions during the program. At the end, we will select some of the questions to answer, and we'll try our best to get to as many as we can in the allotted time. For today's talk, Narrative in the Work of Faith Ringgold, Glenn Ligon, and Kerry James Marshall, we are joined by Hannah Klemm, the Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, and Victoria McCraven, the 2020-2021 Romare Bearden Graduate Museum Fellow. Thanks so much for being here today with us, Hannah and Victoria.
Thanks, Jessica, and welcome, everybody. We're very excited to be here to talk about three works in the St. Louis Art Museum's collection, all from the 1990s, that really utilize language and narrative in really exciting ways. And these are three of, I think we would consider them some of the most important works from this era in the museum. And all three of them are currently on view if you're in the St. Louis area and have the ability to go to the museum. So we're going to first kind of set the stage a little bit and talk a little bit about the 90s, which that kind of context really matters to all three of these artists, even though they're incredibly relevant in the present moment. They came out of a very specific moment in the 90s. And one of the things about the 90s that's so interesting is it really is this moment of an intense acceleration of globalization. Not that globalization hadn't been pushing through the Cold War. Obviously, the Cold War was an incredibly important aspect of the world connecting and globalizing. But with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, there's an acceleration to, I think, most individuals' ability to connect across the world, particularly with the simultaneous emergence of the internet in around 1989. And then, email became very common in the 90s. Not that long ago, but also feels like forever, I think, in a way. So, mobile phones, the internet, television, all of these things really accelerated and connected people. And one of the things with art that caused was a kind of fragmented and decentered art world. And I mean those things in a positive way. It was an ability for the art world to connect across places that weren't necessarily seen as art world centers. And through this, there was also an emergent pluralism and sort of multiculturalism that came out of this moment that was really, really opening up the art world to a global landscape. And this is kind of coming out of the 1980s, which are known from the kind of blue chip or, majority art world as being about very big paintings, expressionistic paintings, kind of a return to the heroic art genius. A lot of artists in the 90s turned against that. And they were artists of diverse backgrounds, were motivated to challenge the white sociocultural authority through various medias. And while we're going to focus on things that all kind of resemble paintings, many artists were pushing both the boundaries of what painting could be, but also utilizing performance, intervention, techniques of appropriation, and media works as well. So these things are all coming together for this really, big moment that I think we can all say really continues into our present artistic landscape. So the three artists that we're going to discuss works of in more depth, we're all really much a part of this. Glenn Ligon gave voice to the experience of oppression in really exceptionally savvy and conceptual ways. Artists like Faith Ringgold made powerful work that broke down gender and racial stereotypes. And Kerry James Marshall embraced the contentious historical meaning of a painting in new ways that both look at painting's own history and his present moment. And his paintings, I think, also highly resonate to all of the cultural concerns of today. So we're going to start with, and we're happy, so please feel free to throw questions into the Q&A box. We're happy to address anything at the end to talk more about, the contingent histories of these works or anything individual about the works as we go through the program. So we will leave some time for that at the end, as Jessica said. Just have to figure out how to advance my slides. So the first work we're going to look at is Glenn Ligon's Study for Frankenstein #1, which was brought into the museum in 2001, but it was painted in 1992. And Glenn Lagon was born in 1960 in the Bronx, New York. And he studied painting in college. And he actually started out working in an abstract expressionist mode. He was very interested in the expressive qualities of paint and painting. But in 1985, he was accepted into the prestigious Whitney Museum's Independent Study Program, which is application. You apply to be a part of this group, and it's art historians, curators, critics, and artists. And it's a kind of intensive program that talks about art theory and contemporary art of the moment. And this program really changed Glenn Lagon's approach to art. And he really grew frustrated with the limitations of abstract painting and the sort of individualism of these gestures. And so after 1985, his style really shifted, and he started to think about art within a broader conceptual and theoretical paradigm. And from that point on, his work really has engaged in a relentless reflection on both identity construction and the legacies of American post-war art. So he became interested in really interrogating the type of painting that he had started his career doing, as well as really thinking about how individual identities and collective identities are embodied in art making. And his work can very much be situated within this shift that we were discussing at the beginning in the 1990s. As he expanded his practice into addressing appropriation, the use of everyday objects, and creating a conceptual framework where there are sort of layers of meaning and layers of understanding that you have to bring to the work to read through it. And so he starts embedding these kind of socio-political narratives into the work using language. And so in this work, you can see he has taken a sentence. So this is part of a series of his text paintings. So he started in 1988. He became interested in exploring this identity construction, but how it was shaped by history, how individual identities as well as collective identities are shaped by history and history of culture as well, and by your own relationality to the world. And so he began this series of text paintings, which there are many of. It's worth, you can look around and you can find many of the other ones as well. And he began these in 1988. And his first painting in this style was made on a door. He actually got an old door instead of a canvas and stenciled the words on the door. And it was a quote he selected from the essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, written in 1928 by the Harlem Renaissance writer Zora Neale Hurston. And the phrase that Ligon chose to repeat over and over again is, I feel most colored when I am thrown against a sharp white background. And he again stenciled these words in black on a sharp white background. So he's creating this material connection to the phrase, but also the deep underlying social, political and identity-based content of the text, both the text in terms of its historical relationship to narrative and the history of literature, but as well as his own personal experiences as an African American man in New York as well. And he's primarily been interested in using texts for these paintings that deal with race, gender, representation, and forms of communication. So in other early works, he used text by Ralph Ellison from Invisible Man and James Baldwin's Stranger in the Village. So those are two other works. However, he only uses a very small fragment of these texts. So usually a sentence, maybe not even a complete sentence. And he simplifies it into this minimalist form, as you can see here. And so to make these works, such as this one and these other text paintings, he uses an oil stick, which is it's basically like thick oil-based pigment into a crayon-like stick, but they have like a thick diameter. And then he would buy everyday stencils from a hardware store. He would take the oil stick and rub over each letter to create the sentence. And so then he picked the stencil up and moved it down. But he started to notice as he moved down, bits of oil paint from the stencil would drag along with it. And he started to really think this was a wonderful element of the painting. So as he kind of hand wrote out the words, they also became abstracted as it moved down the painting. So at the beginning, the language is very clear, but by the bottom, the language is quite abstract. And for Ligon, this kind of positioned the material, the paint, the material of the painting and sort of politicized it because of how it was being used with the language and because of how the language became obscured. There was an actual material quality to the conceptual framework. And so in this painting, Study for Frankenstein #1, Lagon has taken a sentence from Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein, and the painting reads, "Sometimes I wished to express my sensations in my own mode, but the uncouth and inarticulate sounds which broke from me frightened me into silence again." And so this novel is one of the few novels he chose to use for one of these language paintings that isn't by an African-American author, but it is a novel that has often been associated with ideas of othering and otherness. And he's chosen this really poignant part of the book where the creature is actually looking back at a moment in its own history where it spoke and it thought it was saying something clearly to a child, and the child was terrified by the sound of its voice. So it's this moment of understanding your own relationship, your own otherness, and your own difference, but looking back at it from a moment in the future. So for Ligon, this kind of act of reading and rereading the lines, so we have to think as viewers or visitors to the museum, we have to think about that line. We read that line. We don't necessarily know where in the book it is. We don't even necessarily know the book if we haven't read it. So he creates this really beautiful narrative distancing where we have to think about the line that he's chosen and written from our own place as a viewer, from our own identity. But then we also kind of construct it within this lineage of distancing that he creates. So it's a Glenn Ligon painting. He chose that line. What does that mean? He chose that line by a book by Mary Shelley. What does that mean? Mary Shelley chose to write that line in 1818. What does that mean? So it creates this layering of understanding and thinking through both the meaning of narrative, but also how experience, literature, words, and phrases impact our own being in the present moment. And I think that's one of the things that makes Ligon's paintings so powerful, is that they can connect the individual identity with the collective and our collective shared history of literature, but also of experience. And he creates this kind of open meaning structure. So I know it sometimes with these conceptual works feels like you have to know a whole lot to understand them, but they're also very much about the material qualities. They're about the paint. They're about really thinking about what those words mean. So there's a surface quality to understanding the work that's completely a wonderful way to approach this work. But then you can also keep digging through the layers of understanding of how this artwork works within its own moment and within our present moment. So I'm going to end talking about Lagon with a quote from the artist. So he said, when he was describing these paintings, these text paintings, quote, "I would say that all of my work has been invested in the notion of theorizing and visualizing whiteness in some way, because its construction is so linked to the ways that we perceive blackness. Misreading of these works comes from critics who think that these two issues are discrete and separable." And so for Ligon, it's really important because you're questioning both the dominant culture and the othering and the otherness of African American identity, but of a diverse multicultural range of identity politics. And he's always finding ways of examining how we see, how we read, and putting these words on display and visualing the narrative while always asking us the question of who has a voice. And that becomes a question that runs through a lot of these paintings, is whose voice, whose histories. And Victoria's going to talk a little about this wonderful work by Faith Ringgold.
Yes, thank you, Hannah. Absolutely. I think something that's running through all three of the works that we're going to discuss today is the voice of the artist, but also the narrative storytelling that goes through it, whether it be fictional, whether it be a historical text, as we saw in the Ligon, or an autobiographical narrative, as we're going to talk about later in the Kerry James Marshall. But yes, I'm very excited to talk about a really important work in the museum's collection for its international acclaim. Joe Baker's birthday, 1993, came to the St. Louis Art Museum in 1994 as part of the Current 57 exhibition, which ran from March to May of 1994. At the time of the exhibition, there were 7 works, including Joe Baker's birthday and an early notable work known as Mother's Quilt. Joe Baker's birthday comes from Ringgold's series French Collection Part 2, which included a total of 4 works, which follow a fictional character known as William Marie Simone living in Paris in the 1920s, and her various interactions with European artists and influential African-American women throughout the series of these 4 quilts. At the time of the exhibition, Faith Ringgold said this: "I have a responsibility to myself and to coming generations of artists. I would like to be the one who helps them to do what they want to do. That is the point of being an artist." And when Ringgold came to the St. Louis Art Museum, she had already established an amazing career and had influence in the New York art scene, but her international reach was still growing. Born in 1930 in Harlem, Ringgold grew up on 146th Street, and she came from a family of teachers, so education was a very important part of her life growing up. As a child, she had severe asthma and therefore stayed home from school during her early education and spent a lot of time making art. Her mother was a dressmaker and designer and encouraged her talent. And growing up at the end of the Harlem Renaissance, Faith Ringgold was surrounded by music, writing, and art. In 1955, Ringgold received her bachelor's degree from the City College of New York and went on to earn her master's degree at the same school in 1959, which is really exceptional as a Black woman during that time period. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Ringgold was an important presence in protesting for the representation of people of color and women in the New York art scene. And in the 1980s, she began to experiment with the story quilt, which is probably her most famous works at this time. And in these story quilts, she combined her own identity, but also a lot of the formal aspects she was being taught throughout her schooling and coursework. So her story quilts combine 3 essential elements: painting, upholstery, and narrative. She starts with a piece of canvas, layering a base color, and then she begins to attach pieces of upholstery fabric, cutting them into blocks. And she would stylize these pieces of upholstery, and in her studio, she had an assistant go in and mark the quilting lines as well. And so after baking this quilt, which is around the edges, she would continue to build the paint in the main canvas layer of the work. In these works, she mainly incorporates gender and race. And at the center of the composition in this work, you can see Josephine Baker, who was born in St. Louis in 1906. Baker went on to have a successful international career as an entertainer, making her first debut in Paris in 1925 at just the age of 19. Though Ringgold is making clear connections to Matisse in this work, she's also depicting the experience and importance of the Black expatriate community in Paris. Artists such as Aaron Douglas, Lois Mailou Jones, Augusta Savage, and Romare Bearden all spent time studying in France. And she's really capturing an important cultural exchange that still continues today. So I think a part of this work that is often overlooked is the detailed narrative that is surrounding the work. And if you could have a chance to visit the museum, you're able to see this and follow this narrative that she's saying. So there's 12 sections to this letter that is written from the fictional character William Marie Simone. And she's writing to her aunt. And in the first panel, she's describing a portrait that she's began of Josephine Baker, and it's featuring her on her birthday. And as she keeps going into the second panel, she describes the main influences of the painting, which are by Matisse, and the European influences of the painting as well. And the kind of the example she's trying to draw from in the portrait component of the painting. She talks of her admiration for Baker and meeting her for the first time in Paris. But by the sixth panel, Ringgold shifts the tone, and we break from this imaginary narrative that was constructed, and we return to the reality of how Baker was seen and how many Black women were seen during this time period in the 1920s and 30s. And she reminds us that as a Black woman, Baker would not have been appreciated for her talents. And as we keep going through the story, she reflects on beauty, love, and motherhood, and the many challenges that face Black women in regard to all those areas. And she reflects on particularly Baker grappling with wanting a career and children in panel 11, where she makes direct reference to St. Louis, which is why this is a really important piece to have here in the museum. They hated us for our jet black poverty and despair, as they did little Josephine Frieda from Gratoy Street in St. Louis, Missouri. We cling to the one thing that will love us no matter what, our own flesh and blood, our creation, our children. So she kind of ends this work on a really ominous note. And in the final panel, she says, what will be the result of the racism Josephine suffered? Can she ever feel completely loved? So here, what would seem as just an appreciation for Josephine Baker, when you kind of narrow in on what's being said in this fictional narrative, she's reflecting on how, though Josephine Baker has had this international acclaim and she's had this amazing career in her own country, she's not respected, she's not seen as special, and she's not acknowledged for her beauty. And I think a lot of what Ringgold is saying here, it was something that was being said in the 20s, something that was being said in the 90s when she made this work, and something that's even being said today, which I think is what she's leaving with us in this 12th panel. This is a really layered piece, and it still holds a lot of relevance. And I think it's something we'll continue to think about. But next, I'm going to hand it off to Hannah to talk about another work in the collection that talks about migration, but also something that we acquired as a museum shortly after it was made.
Yeah, so the final work we're going to talk about, Victoria, are going to kind of tag team this. So we'll go back and forth talking about this amazing work. This is just one of the masterpieces of the St. Louis Art Museum's contemporary collection. This is Watts 1963 by Kerry James Marshall. So this is a work from a series of 5 paintings that was called the Garden series, and each work in the series features a garden-named housing project. There are 4 in the series that feature Chicago area housing projects. Kerry James Marshall was born in Birmingham, Alabama, but he lived in LA for his childhood and then moved to Chicago in 1987. But this one, as Victoria mentioned earlier, is the autobiographical one of this series. And so this is image of Nickerson Gardens, which is a housing project in Watts in LA. And Kerry James Marshall and his family moved here from Birmingham, Alabama when he was 8 years old. And Victoria, do you want to talk a little bit about that historical moment?
Yes, absolutely. So I think what Marshall is talking about here is the Great Migration, which in St. Louis we know is a really important movement of Black people to St. Louis, but I think we don't necessarily know the scale in which it was happening. So 6 million people moved to the Midwest from the rural South between 1916 and 1970 to escape the Jim Crow racial violence that was happening in the South. And by 1919, 1 million Black people had left. And another important leg here is Los Angeles. I think we don't think about the West Coast as much when we're talking about the Great Migration, but here you see that increase in migration after World War II, and they needed a lot of workers for the defense industry. And a lot of the African-American people that were coming to this area were from Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. And that's why also I think this work is really unique, because the one that's not taking place in the Midwest, but also is happening at this really important historical moment. He's phrasing it here in 1963, but on the cusp of a moment in which the Watts Uprising was going to happen just 2 years later. So I think Marshall is really setting this up as a really historical moment and building it towards, I think, a lot of things that we're still thinking about today in terms of public housing.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that's so interesting about this series of works. So he was inspired, the story that Marshall tells is that he was really inspired when he was driving on, it's I-90-94, the Dan Ryan Expressway, which runs through north-south through Chicago. And he drove by the Stateway Gardens housing project at 36th and Federal. And it brought back these memories of his own family moving to Nickerson Gardens. And he was organizing a show at the Art Institute at the time, and he was trying to figure out what he was going to paint. And one of the things he was really interested in was the real complexities and the ambivalence that he felt towards housing projects, not as wholly negative, which was very much the narrative of the time as a complete failure, but also definitely not as wholly positive. And he really wanted to create a series that would speak to that ambivalence, but also, he saw this Art Institute show as possibly being a predominantly white visitorship, and he really wanted to force a dialogue about this moment and about thinking really about that ambivalence of housing projects and its history. And an important fact is this is painted in 1995, and it was in 1995 that Caprini Green demolition began. It didn't finish until 2011, but in Chicago at this moment, really thinking about housing projects, thinking about displacement of peoples was on the mind of the housing authority and the city at large. So Marshall's really tapping into a historic moment with the painting, as well as the historic moment that Victoria was talking about of his own personal history. So you start to see the layers of history and narrative in these paintings. And one of the things he does in all of them is he takes the housing authority sign, and it's based exactly on the one that would have been on the properties. He also bases them, excuse me, on images of the housing projects themselves. So you could recognize Nickerson Gardens in an image from this. But then he layers all of these other paints and forms and sort of decorative abstractions over the top. Victoria, did you want to maybe talk a little bit about some of that? Let me get us a detail.
So there you see this rising or setting sun. So for them, when they moved to Los Angeles, is quite an auspicious move, but it wasn't. But as we see now, knowing in the future what was going to happen, it's a bit of dramatic irony here on part of the young children that are being shown playing here, and the bluebirds holding the sign "Here We Rest," which used to be an old semblance of Alabama. So bringing a bit of their hometown to Los Angeles, but is it really their resting place? Is it a place of peace, or is that kind of a negative interpretation of "Here We Rest"? So I think there's a lot of double meaning that Marshall is playing on here. And here we see a little girl, his sister, playing telephone with Marshall, who is kneeling, and then the older brother, who is crouched on the bottom of the frame. And all three figures are wearing white, which suggests their innocence and not knowing what's going to happen. But also we are intruding on their play. We're disrupting what they're doing. And you can see Marshall's sister is looking directly back at us as viewers in this work. And it's really just a captivating vignette here of the three kids playing.
Yeah, and here you can see Kerry James Marshall's kind of iconic style of painting Black figures. He used many shades of black and used three types of black paint, which all were a combination of kind of more modern paints and old paints. So there's one that's kind of a burnt kind of tusk bone material that was turned into a paint. And he was really interested in using black paint to showcase what he saw as the sort of invisibility and visibility of Blackness, and the sort of metaphor of Blackness as both a color and, racial identity. And he says that for him, using Blackness was a way to construct Blackness as an abstraction. And so you can also see that with the way he layers the decoration. He's playing with the literal narrative, with the abstraction, with the different guises that we all would bring to these stories to create this really multifaceted story within this painting. And the other thing you can see from this image is how there's grommets, like kind of a circular metal holes. So this was intended to almost look like a stage set, like a vignette. So he's taking the painting off the stretcher to make it in some ways more informal, but also this kind of picture onto a world.
It's just a really stunning work, because I think when you see it in the museum as an unstretched canvas, you can see how it kind of just bleeds into the wall itself. And I think that's really what Marshall wanted when he made this work, for it to be something that was high art, but also something that you saw was in motion, and that the people in it were in motion, that this narrative was still being told. But yes, just an incredible piece in the museum's collection that I hope everyone can go and see.
Yeah. So maybe it's Jessica. Do we have any comments or questions? Is a good time to open it up.
Well, we don't have any yet. So if anyone watching is interested in asking a question or having a comment, please type that into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I do have a question actually about this Marshall piece. Do we know the significance of the young boy who's at the very bottom, who's laying on the ground? It just seems like an interesting position to be in, to be at play.
Victoria and I were actually talking about this in one of our prep, and these kind of ambiguities are part of it, but I think it's very much a part of that he's trying to show, this tension that exists in how housing projects ended up functioning, and how people envisioned them functioning. So there's these kind of layers of the figures. He also is really interested in pastoral paintings as part of that historical trajectory. And pastoral paintings often have these groupings of figures that are almost in a triangle. But these are the narratives to read into. And as we were saying, this is the only one that's depicting members of his own family. They all the different paintings have different groupings of figures, but this one is also very much about his own history and his own relationship to these places. So it's not a super clear answer, but it's all playing into this level of ambivalence.
Yes, the crouched figure is quite unsettling when you see the work in person, and so it is something that we've been thinking about. It's a level of discomfort that I think maybe Marshall is trying to portray to the viewer as well. You're not exactly sure what he's doing, but the figure is in another place mentally, not quite existing in the landscape that's being portrayed.
And he did draw all the shadows to almost look like people were falling into holes.
Okay, that's interesting because that was the next question. Someone asked why the oval shadows. So there you go. Okay. Also, so could you talk a little bit more? So I know these three works currently, where they're on view in the museum, as part of a kind of a smallish exhibition called Expressive Narratives. What other works are in that show? If you could talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, so this is in a gallery rotation in the East Building, which is where we house our contemporary collection at SLAM, and it's called Expressive Narratives, and it's artworks from about 1972 to 2018-19, basically. So it's a really wide group of works, and it's looking at artists who were kind of reappraising history painting, but also telling narratives that are both connected to autobiography, history, literature. So the other works in the room are Christina's Day Off, which is by Robert Colescott. There's a painting by Marcus Lupertz, which I'm not going to get the number right. It's like Interior 3, Dithyrambic Interior 3. Sorry, I wasn't prepared for this, Jessica. And then Kehinde Wiley's Charles I, which was the painting that was acquired by the museum out of the Kehinde Wiley St. Louis exhibition. So it features a local North St. Louis resident posed in the pose of a Dutch old master painting that's also in the collection. And am I missing anything, or is that all of it? And then these three. Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Sorry, we didn't mean to put you on the spot. Someone else has asked, do we know what the red banner says in this in the Marshall?
No, and it's another one where what is missing we haven't really found, but it's theirs and more of everything is what you can actually see. So it's kind of this tension between the utopia of these projects and the social and basically the social and human failures. So that's where all of the tension is playing. And he talks about these works as with the banners and the bluebirds. And the bluebirds are a state bird, I think, of Alabama. Victoria, do you remember?
I'm not sure about the birds, unfortunately.
But they're related to something. And then he calls it a Disneyfication. So it's this way of kind of thinking about those moments in Disney like old Disney movies that like animation pops up. He was sort of thinking about that to again create this tension between that kind of the child on the ground, the black circles, the housing project architecture, but then this kind of alternative of the utopia. So it's this playing this utopianism off of the sort of failures that were really brought upon by human error.
Okay. I think this will probably be our last question. And this, you may not know this. So, actually, we just had another. So, how close in proximity was Nickerson Gardens to the Watts riots?
It was right there. And
Okay.
he actually, him and his family moved to a house in central Los Angeles 2 years after Nickerson Gardens. So that was one of the reasons he has this ambivalence. Is he talks about in an interview is that his family was there for 2 years, used the experience, saved money, and moved out. And then he was actually his house where he grew up in LA for the rest of the time was really near some Black Panther headquarters, and they had a huge influence on his thinking of about civil rights and social justice. And he talks about the proximity to the Watts uprising and how it was all right. It was in there. So they left 2 years later. It's one of the reasons the painting has the date on there, is because it's kind of signaling that moment. And I don't, it's worth looking up, but they're doing some kind of a renewal project on Nickerson Gardens right now, I saw when I was looking it up. So it's still there. It's just, it's not one that got torn down. So it is still there. But they're doing some kind of an urban renewal project on it right now.
Okay. All right. So this will be the last question. The visitor asks, forgive my ignorance, but didn't you say that Faith Ringgold's mother sewed? And she wanted to know if Faith collaborated on any works with her mother.
Yes. So before the work I mentioned, Mother's Quilt, which is an early work from the 80s, that was made to commemorate her mother. So when Faith first started making the quilts, I think the very first one she made with her mother, and maybe the second as well. But yes, in the beginning, she did collaborate in the early works, and then some of them went on to commemorate her mother after she passed.
Okay, thanks. So I have dropped in some links, a link to each of these works on the museum's website in the chat. So if you want to click on one of those, that'll take you directly to the artwork on our website. And Victoria, do you want to talk about
if you're interested in more textile works, Jo Baker's birthday is going to be featured in a virtual program that's going to happen on March 10th, if it wasn't for the women. So please register for that. We're going to have 3 contemporary artists talk about fiber art. It's called Ancestral Threads. So if you want to hear more about practices of artists that are working in St. Louis and internationally, please tune in.
All right. Well, thanks to both of you, Victoria and Hannah, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. If you'd like, you can register to join me next week to hear the artist Buzz Spector speak in conjunction with his exhibition, Buzz Spector Alterations, now on view at the museum. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.